Hello there. Tonight we are going to peel back the velvet curtain on a wedding. Not yours, don't worry, but one from about 700 years ago. Imagine a girl barely 12 waking up not to excitement or butterflies, but to silence, candle smoke, and the weight of velvet she didn't choose. Her dress scratches at the neck. Her mother tightens her bodice not with love, but with strategy. It's her wedding day, and she's being dressed to be sold. You probably won't survive this day. Not because you'll be maimed or executed, though honestly neither is off the table, but because surviving as a medieval bride meant surrendering your name, your body, your autonomy, and very likely your life in childbirth within a few years. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. I love seeing where you're watching from. Drop your city and local time in the comments below. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The morning begins early. Too early. It's still dark when she's pulled from bed, still more child than woman. In another century, she might be getting ready for school, fussing over breakfast. But here, someone's brushing ash from her cheek and braiding her hair into a crown she didn't ask for. The hearth glows low smoke, curling around dried herbs, and her mother hums not from joy, but out of nervous habit. She's not marrying for love. That's not what weddings are for here. She's marrying because her father owes someone a favor, or because a neighboring baron offered 10 good oxen and the right to a stream. There may have been a contract drawn up before she was even weaned, a future sealed in ink before her baby teeth fell out. She knows the man only as a name maybe glimpsed once from behind a tapestry. The dress is stiff. It was her grandmother's let out at the seams and re-dyed a hopeful shade of blue, like that supposed to change anything. The fabric smells of cedar-damp stone and cold metal. Her shoes are tight. Everything's tight. She's not told what the ceremony will entail, but she knows she must kneel, stand bow and speak when told. Not too loud, not too soft. Smile if she remembers. The house begins to fill with footsteps. Aunts arrive with hard kisses and sour wine. Her brothers stay hidden. Her father is outside drinking already. Everyone is bustling around, but no one talks to her, not really. The bride isn't the center of attention. She's the centerpiece, yes. The object on display. But this wedding isn't for her. It's for the landowners, the families, the deal. Her stomach knots. She hasn't eaten. Someone hands her bread, then scolds her for taking too big a bite. You'll bloat the dress. She hides it under a cushion when no one's looking. Down the lane, the groom's party is approaching on horseback. Men laughing, dogs barking, flags snapping in the wind. There's music of sorts. Flutes, maybe. Bells. Something shrill that sets her nerves even tighter. Her hands are cold. Not from the weather. It's spring, maybe. But from knowing this is the last morning she'll ever be herself. From this moment on, she belongs to someone else. It's strange how weddings in this time aren't just ceremonies, they're performances of power. Everything is choreographed. Where she stands, how far she bows, who ties what ribbon. Even the order of procession is a form of politics. Her place in line reflects her family's status, one cousin behind a knight, another before the baker's daughter. Nothing is accidental. You might think the ceremony is the start of a marriage, but here it's more like the signing over of a deed. She is the property. Her body will prove the contract soon enough. Her womb will be the ledger, but for now she is still technically a girl. And the town watches her like they're watching the weather, curious, removed, expectant. Will she bear sons? Will she survive childbirth? Will she obey? Historians still debate whether girls like her fully understood what was about to happen. Some argue that they were shielded by ignorance, others that they knew too much from watching sisters and cousins disappear into marriage and never come back quite right. They say the average medieval marriage was entered at 14 for girls sometimes younger. The aristocracy especially loved early marriages. It locked down alliances before the child could even form opinions. Boys married later, often in their 20s. This meant the groom approaching today could be double or triple her age. He might already have a limp or a missing tooth or an eye that doesn't quite look you in the face. Outside, there are cheers. A dog barks. Her father bellows something in Latin he barely understands. The men start boasting about how pretty she'll look, how quiet she seems, about how much land this union will secure. They laugh as if this is all just another round of cards, and in a way it is. The doorway is framed in rushes and flowers. The priest is waiting. The neighbors line the lane. Everyone is watching, even the ones pretending not to. And the bride, she is walking forward on numb feet. Her veil trembles. Not from the wind. She doesn't cry, not yet. Crying is for after. Right now, she just needs to remember to nod at the right times, to say the words she's been told, to look as if this is the best day of her life. There's an odd little superstition she clings to, whispered by her cousin. If the ring slips easily onto her finger, it means fewer babies. If it sticks, God help her. As the ceremony begins and Latin chants swirl like smoke around her, she flexes her fingers behind the bouquet, just once, just in case. Because after today, her hands won't belong to her anymore. Not really. Not her hands, her name, or her story. She will be rewritten, repurposed, renamed. The girl will disappear, and the wife will take her place. And the truth is, she never had a choice. The arrangement was made long before the girl ever laid eyes on the man she would be forced to marry, long before she knew how to read her own name or understand what a vow even meant. It happened over meat and mulled wine, with men in fur-lined cloaks leaning over a rough-hewn table, one chewing a chicken bone, another pressing the point of a dagger into wood as he considered the exchange. There was no poetry, no flowers, no declarations of fate, just property leverage, debt, and timing. They spoke in hushed tones about alliances, about stream rights, about merging two struggling estates into one barely functioning one, and somewhere in that discussion her life was sealed in invisible ink. They might have laughed when the youngest lord at the table declared that the girl would be ready once she bled. Her body, not yet developed, was just another future asset, calculated like an unripe orchard. In medieval Europe, marriages weren't unions of souls, they were scaffolding for survival, blueprints of bloodlines, plans of consolidation. No one asked if the bride or the groom liked each other. No one cared. The union was a contract, and contracts were binding, especially when signed with wax threats or the looming approval of a bishop. In noble circles, children were engaged before they had their first teeth. Fathers negotiated with other fathers, matching land with dowry bloodline, with title debt, with forgiveness. Contracts were drawn up that included stipulations like how many pigs would be delivered after the wedding, what field rights would be reassigned, and what would happen if the bride died before she could fulfill her primary function. In one recorded case, the document clearly stated that if the girl didn't survive to marriage age, her younger sister would automatically take her place like a replacement part ordered in advance. It was gruesome logistics masquerading as tradition. The girl, for her part, might have been promised before she knew what marriage even was. She might have met the man once from across a muddy courtyard. He could be 3 times her age, scarred from battle, red-nosed from wine, and entirely uninterested in conversation. But he was the one who could secure the land her family needed, so he was the one she would wed. It wasn't just the nobility who made these arrangements. Among peasants, the motivations were humbler but no less transactional. A daughter might be given in marriage to pay off a neighbor's loan, to settle a family grudge, or to earn the use of a better plow. Sometimes it was for a sheep. Sometimes it was because someone owed someone else 6 barrels of ale. And if that sounds absurd, remember that in communities where everyone scraped by on less than nothing, a marriage was a bargaining chip too precious to be left to the whims of a girl's heart. The age of marriage varied by region and class, but for girls puberty was usually the signal that their value had ripened. 12 was not young, 12 was considered optimal. By 14 she was practically a spinster if no one had claimed her. Consent technically was required, but only in the same way that modern software asks if you accept the terms and conditions after it's already installed. Her father could pressure, coerce, isolate, or starve her into saying yes, and the church would record that as willing participation. If she wept, it was because she was overwhelmed with joy. If she fainted, it was because she was overwhelmed with holiness. Even a whispered protest could be dismissed as nerves or shyness or a temporary madness to be prayed away. Historians still debate how complicit families truly were, whether mothers fought against these matches or simply resigned themselves. There are tales of matriarchs giving their daughters quiet warnings, of grandmothers sneaking herbs into wedding night wine, of whispered prayers that the husband be gentle or at the very least quick. But just as many records describe families treating the wedding as a business success. The father's chest would puff out with pride at the size of the dowry he'd secured or the quality of the livestock gifted in exchange. In some cases, the bride price, a sum paid by the groom's family to the brides, would be negotiated with the same seriousness as a sale of land, and that's because it was. The girl was land, metaphorically speaking. She would bear heirs who would inherit real fields. Her body was the means of production. Her fertility was the factory. She wasn't the bride. She was the field being tilled. The bride price might be cows or silver or barrels of honey, depending on region and wealth. And the dowry from her family could bankrupt an entire household. Some families desperate to keep up appearances would sell land, or take on debt to offer enough gold or linen to attract a higher status groom. And if they couldn't afford it, then the daughter might be married to someone much older, or known to be cruel, or simply uninterested in human decency. In some cases, girls were married off to debt collectors directly. Others were promised to monks turned soldiers turned landowners in arrangements that weren't just unfortunate, but genuinely dangerous. Wealthier families sometimes bought what we might call dowry insurance, paying to protect the investment in case the marriage fell through or the groom turned out to be too violent to keep the girl alive. None of this included her voice. If she had opinions, they were dismissed. If she had preferences, they were irrelevant. She could be clever. She could be educated. She could have someone else she loved, but none of that made it into the paperwork. Her value was calculated by her virginity, her family's assets, and how many healthy children her mother had already delivered. If her mother had died in childbirth, that might even increase her perceived risk as a bride. Some men worried about inherited pelvic structure, and yes, that made it into some contracts. Some girls weren't even informed until days before the wedding. They were simply handed a new dress and told to smile. There are chilling letters from this era. One tells of a girl named Sabine who tried to flee her betrothal by hiding in a hayloft. She was dragged down beaten and locked in a pantry until she agreed. She was 14. Her father signed the contract the next morning. Another account tells of Beatrice, age 13, who begged her local priest to annul her betrothal to a man she called the monster with wine breath. The priest told her to pray harder. She was dead within the year, likely from childbirth. Her death was noted in the parish ledger with a small cross and the words resting in the Lord's grace. Guests at weddings didn't raise objections. They came to witness, not intervene. They commented on the food, the dress, the harvest season. They might chuckle at the age gap or the bride's fear. They might offer blessings through gritted teeth. But no one saw it as wrong. It was tradition. The bride stood still. The groom gripped her hand. The ring slid over her knuckles like a lock clicking into place. And that's the truth. The wedding wasn't the start of a love story. It was the conclusion of a transaction. The legal and social framework was in place, the economic exchange completed, and the only step left was to carry it out in front of witnesses so no one could claim otherwise. The music played, the wine flowed, and the girl disappeared into the contract she never signed but could never escape. The guests are settling in, the priest is clearing his throat, and the bride is trembling slightly in shoes that do not quite fit. She doesn't speak, but she doesn't have to. Everyone else is speaking for her. The fathers are exchanging glances that say, "This is a good match, and she'll be useful," while the groom fidgets with the belt at his waist and grins like a man who has just purchased a fine piece of land. Because in truth, that's exactly how the ritual is framed. The medieval wedding ceremony wasn't about love or romance, it was a carefully choreographed, deeply symbolic legal transfer of ownership. Every motion, every phrase, every object placed or exchanged had a weight that far exceeded its surface meaning. This wasn't just a party. This was a contract being publicly ratified by God, the Church, the community, and every witness present. The Latin murmured by the priest wasn't all blessing and benevolence. Embedded in those holy words were layers of social structure, legal assumption, and hierarchy. The bride, silent and often staring downward, was about to be absorbed into her husband's household, his legal standing and his will. In some parts of Europe she would vow to be bonny and buxom in bed, and had borrowed a medieval phrase that meant she was expected to be cheerful, fertile, and obedient, both in the bedroom and at the dinner table. The groom made no such promises. His vow was to protect, to provide terms that sounded noble, but in practice gave him the right to command, to discipline, and to claim her body whenever he wished. The vows were never equal. They weren't meant to be. The most haunting part, she was often handed from one man to another with a literal transfer of physical contact. Her father would escort her down the aisle, and then at the appointed moment place her hand in the hand of the groom. This wasn't symbolic. It was a statement of transaction. One man relinquished control, and another accepted it, like the handing off of reins, like giving a servant to a new master. The ring he placed on her finger wasn't just jewelry, it was a mark of ownership. It might have been inscribed with a blessing or a motto, but at its core, it functioned like a tag. This one belongs to me. Historians still debate whether these rituals felt as solemn as they sound, or if, like many human traditions, they were carried out with a kind of exhausted inevitability. Did the audience understand the weight of what was happening? Or was it just another social duty like harvesting hay or baptizing a baby? There are accounts of weddings where no one even smiled, where the mood was grim, where the bride barely whispered her responses. Other records show guests cracking jokes, snickering about the wedding night, or speculating about how long it would take for the first baby to appear. Either way, the ceremony did what it was designed to do: erase the bride's prior identity and replace it with a new one crafted in her husband's image. Take, for example, the strange symbolism of the threshold. After the wedding, the groom would often carry the bride over it, not out of sweetness, but to prevent her from tripping a superstition that said if the bride stumbled, the marriage would fail. But over time, this became a metaphor for ownership. He carried her into his house because she was now part of it, furniture perhaps, but more likely livestock. The home became her cage. The door could be closed behind her, and legally it was now her prison. In noble houses, the legal aspect of the wedding was even more intense. Contracts were read aloud, itemizing what goods would change hands, what lands were being conjoined, what penalties applied if heirs were not produced. Yes, penalties. A noble bride who failed to bear sons could be sent back, her dowry forfeited. Or worse, kept around blamed for the barrenness whispered about behind her back, until she vanished into a nunnery or a tomb. One odd fact from a 15th century noble household: a bride was presented with a ledger on her wedding day, not as a gift, but as a tool to track the inventory of her husband's estate. She was expected to manage it efficiently, without complaint and certainly without pay, and for the poor. The ceremony was less grand, but no less binding. A village priest, a few neighbors, a patch of muddy ground. No gold rings, perhaps just a piece of twine or a promise made over clasped hands. But once spoken, the words held. There were no lawyers to argue duress, no escape clauses. The priest's blessing sealed it as surely as chains. Of course, not every bride was 12 or 13. Some were older, 18 or even 20. Some had known their grooms for months, even years. But the system didn't change. Whether arranged early or late, whether dreaded or simply endured, the medieval wedding was never an equal partnership. It was a social maneuver performed with legal permanence. Once the priest announced the union, there was no turning back. Divorce was nearly impossible, allowed only under the rarest of circumstances like proven impotence, and even then only for the rich and connected. For everyone else, the vow until death do us part was less a romantic flourish than a sentence to be served. The public nature of the wedding was intentional. It ensured compliance. With witnesses, there could be no question later about whether the bride had agreed. Her silence could be interpreted as assent. Her presence was enough, and that's why people came. They weren't just there for the feast, they were there to legitimize what was essentially a forced transaction. Their eyes sealed the deal. After the ceremony came the bedding, an entirely separate ordeal, but even that was tied into the ritual of ownership. In some regions, the couple's chamber door was left open so that witnesses could hear the sounds of consummation. In others, guests stood outside waiting for proof, a stained sheet, a knowing nod. It was theater, and the bride was the main act whether she wanted to perform or not. No part of the wedding was truly hers. The dress she wore had been chosen by her family. The vows she spoke were written by men. The guests toasted her value, not her happiness. And even the food served at the feast was chosen to reflect the wealth and status of the families involved, not the bride's taste, assuming she had one left. So she stood there through the words, the blessings, the symbols, the scrutiny. She said what she was told to say. She gave her hand. She accepted the ring. She stepped into her new identity with the precision of a pawn being moved across a game board. And when the crowd erupted into cheers, she blinked once and swallowed the last remnants of her former self. The wedding feast, loud and chaotic and full of bread crust crumbs and spilled ale, was not a celebration of union. It was a showcase of assets. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a party. There was music, laughter, roasting meats, turning on spits, and guests packed shoulder to shoulder on rough benches. But underneath the clamor was the steady hum of comparison, which side brought more wealth, which family had the finer cloaks, who gifted what, and most importantly, what the bride was worth. Her value, already exchanged in contract and reinforced in vows, was now on full display in gold linen and food. She sat at the long table, not as a guest of honor, but as part of the evidence. The feast was a continuation of the contract. The dowry had already been paid, often in the form of livestock, land, or coin, but this was the performance of it. The better the feast, the louder the signal to the community that the alliance was profitable, the match advantageous. The bride's family tried to prove their daughter was not a burden, and the groom's family showed that they could keep her. This pressure meant families routinely went into debt to throw a feast that might include venison, imported spices, and barrels of wine. A pig might be slaughtered in her honor not because she was cherished, but because her worth as an asset required embellishment. And heaven help the family who served stale bread or watered ale that would be whispered about for months, maybe even damage future marriage prospects for sisters and cousins. She sat stiffly, often silent, expected to smile without overeating, to look modest but not dull, and to seem virtuous without looking afraid. Any error, dropping her goblet, stumbling over a toast, crying too obviously, could be taken as a bad omen. One odd tradition from 13th century Brittany involved the bride being required to recite her new husband's genealogy at the feast. If she made a mistake, it was considered a sign she was unworthy of his name. Imagine having to memorize an entire family tree while your stomach twisted in knots from fear, while your arms ached from holding a heavy goblet, and while every eye watched you like a cow on auction day. And speaking of cattle, the dowry system itself was a brutal exercise in financial calculation. A dowry was the money or property the bride brought to the marriage. In theory, it was meant to support her if she were widowed. In practice, it was a bribe to make her more marriageable. It could include coin, but also livestock, textiles, kitchenware land, or rights to future inheritance. If the dowry was small, the bride's choices were fewer, her husband likely rougher, older, or of lower status. If the dowry was large, she might marry into better standing, but also become a more valuable object, something to be guarded, used, or even stolen. Historians still debate whether dowries gave women any leverage at all. In some rare cases, widows were able to reclaim part of their dowry after a husband's death, which gave them a temporary window of independence. But this was uncommon. More often, once the dowry changed hands, it was gone. Her husband could gamble it away. He could invest it poorly. He could use it to fund a war, and she had no legal claim to it again. In fact, she couldn't even speak about it in court unless a man vouched for her. Bride price added another twist. In many regions, particularly in Northern Europe, the groom's family paid a bride price to the bride's family. This wasn't for the bride, it was compensation to her father for the loss of his household labor, or a symbolic payment to seal the exchange. The more valuable the girl was perceived to be because of her fertility, her connections, her youth, the higher the price. And once paid, it reinforced her status as property. If something went wrong, if she turned out to be barren or sickly or disobedient, the husband might demand a refund or send her back. There are records of women being returned to their fathers like defective goods the contract voided, with bruises as proof. These practices weren't only formalities for the rich. Among commoners, versions of these transactions played out in plainer terms: less gold, more pigs and barley, but the implications were the same. A daughter with no dowry was a heavy burden. Some families avoided this burden by sending daughters to convents, but even this was a financial strain. Monasteries charged admission. Sometimes in lean years, even nuns were allowed to leave the cloister and re-enter the marriage market if the abbey could profit from it. Some convents sold off girls to local landowners under the guise of assisting with household labor, which was little more than indentured marriage under religious branding. In rare cases, a family might give up altogether. Daughters were left unmarried, considered shameful spinsters, and left to rely on male relatives for the rest of their lives. These women were mocked, marginalized, and pitied, and yet statistically, they had better odds of survival than their married sisters. No childbirth, no legal erasure, no wedding night trauma. But they also had no legal identity of their own, no right to inherit, no standing in their community beyond unclaimed. One particularly cruel paradox was that wealthier daughters could be both more protected and more exploited. Their dowries made them desirable, and thus they had a broader range of suitors. But the very size of their dowry made them targets. Some grooms married primarily for the coin, then promptly neglected or abused the bride. Others schemed to extract her wealth and then divorce or confine her. There's a record of a woman named Cecilia in 1322 who brought an enormous dowry into her marriage: 3 parcels of land and 24 head of cattle. Within a year, her husband had accidentally killed her in a hunting accident and inherited the entire estate. No one questioned it. Why would they? He was within his rights. And so at the wedding feast, the bride sits with eyes downcast and hands folded while the men around her toast and laugh and bar to the next match for some other daughter down the table. She may speak when spoken to, she may accept gifts with a nod, but she is not a participant in her own celebration. She is the vessel, the centerpiece, the contract made flesh. If she's lucky, She might have a kind aunt or older sister whisper a warning tuck charm into her sleeve, or slip her a vial of poppy to dull the pain of what comes next. If she's unlucky, she'll be surrounded by women who simply tell her to breathe, to be brave, and to endure. Because that's the word used most often, endure. Not enjoy, not celebrate, endure. As if this were a surgery, as if this were a funeral, and perhaps in some ways it is. Because beneath the golden goblets, the roasted goose, and the dance of power across the table, this feast is not for her. It is for the deal, and the deal has been made. When the last goblet has been emptied, and the guests have grown loud with drink and victory, when the roast has been picked clean, and the sweetmeats are being passed around like tokens of a triumph already won, the real ceremony begins, not the one in front of the altar, but the one behind the bedchamber door. This part is not written in the church's liturgy, but it is understood, expected, required. The feast was for the village, the consummation is for the contract. No matter how young, how frightened, or how confused the bride may be, this night will not wait. And everyone knows it. The bedding ceremony varied from place to place, but its purpose never changed. It was the final act in the transfer of ownership, the moment when the marriage became real, not emotionally, not spiritually, but legally. The union was not considered complete until it was consummated. Without it, the entire arrangement could be nullified, the dowry returned, and the bride shamed. So while songs are sung downstairs and toasts are made to the virility of the groom, someone, often the groom's male friends or the priest himself, leads the girl to a chamber. In some places she is stripped by the older women of the household, her clothes removed as if peeling back layers of identity. In others, the guests follow the couple to the room, laughing, making jokes, sometimes even staying to listen for proof of what is about to happen. Privacy is a luxury she is not afforded. This isn't intimacy. This is performance. The bed is usually prepared in advance, fresh linens, flowers, maybe some symbolic fruit scattered near the pillows. But it might as well be a butcher's slab. The girl, often no older than 12 or 13, is told to lie still, to be quiet, to let it happen. She has never been touched like this before. She has never been alone in a room with a man. Her education, if any, didn't include what to expect. No one warned her of the pain, the tearing, the bleeding. Her mother may have whispered some instructions between braiding her hair and adjusting her veil, but they would have been vague, framed in euphemism and fear. Be still, don't shame us. It's over quicker if you don't cry. Historians still debate how normalized this experience was, whether brides found ways to protect themselves, or whether families truly believed this was righteous and proper. But medical texts from the time don't lie. They speak plainly of injuries, of bleeding, of torn flesh and split hips. Doctors, almost always men, wrote about ways to treat the bruises and lacerations caused by rough consummation. And yet these weren't viewed as unfortunate side effects. They were expected, a natural part of the process. Some even believed that pain was beneficial, that it proved the girl's virginity, or that it aligned her body with her duty to bear children. One odd fact from 15th century England: some households kept a special blend of herbs and cloths ready for the morning, after designed to clean up any signs of damage, before servants collected the sheets. But if there was no blood at all, if the linens were too clean, rumors could begin. The bride might be accused of having known another man. Her virginity, the very cornerstone of the transaction, would be called into question. In extreme cases, this led to annulments, beatings, or even executions. In slightly less dramatic situations, it led to shame and suspicion that followed her for the rest of her life. If there was blood, it was sometimes displayed. The sheets might be paraded through the village, held up by grinning relatives or groomsmen like a banner of victory. The bride's pain turned into proof. Her humiliation became spectacle. The neighbors would nod and mutter approval. The father would drink deeply, proud that the goods had been delivered intact. And the groom. He was now fully a husband. his power over her body confirmed not by law alone, but by force. The girl meanwhile lay curled under the same sheet that had been hoisted above the crowd an hour earlier. She was sore bleeding and silent. Her body no longer felt like hers. It wasn't. It belonged to the man beside her who might be snoring or drinking again, or already planning the next hunting trip. She might stare at the beams above the bed, counting the knots in the wood to keep from thinking. She might whisper a prayer, not for happiness, but for survival. Because this night, horrible as it was, would not be the last. This was just the beginning. If she refused, if she cried too loudly, or tried to run, or begged to wait, she could be punished. Refusal was seen as defiance, and defiance was treated as sin. Some legal codes explicitly allowed husbands to correct their wives for failure to perform wifely duties. And what was more central to those duties than submission? A wife's consent was considered permanent, given the moment she said her vows. From that point on, her body was no longer under her control. It was his right, his property, his entitlement. The church, far from condemning this violence, sanctified it. Priests preached about obedience, about Eve's original sin, about the need for wives to submit in all things. Some texts advised men to break in their wives' gently language borrowed from the training of horses. Others were less concerned with gentleness. There were sermons that blamed women's suffering on their vanity, their rebellion, or their coldness. The pain was seen as a deserved lesson. The silence afterward was treated as grace. And so morning came. The guests recovered from their hangovers. The servants cleared the bones from the floor. And the bride, no longer a maiden, awoke to a new life. One where every night might be like the first. One where childbirth waited around the corner like a debt collector. One where death even might come not as tragedy, but as expected outcome. Because in some parts of medieval Europe, a girl who reached her 20s without dying in childbirth was considered almost miraculous. The risk wasn't a footnote, it was central, it was baked into the institution. The wedding was a countdown, and the first tick was the wedding night. The cruelty wasn't hidden. It was normalized, encouraged, praised. The very people who toasted her the night before might be the same ones whispering about her bleeding, her silence, her performance. And if she lived through it, if she endured it without running mad or throwing herself down a well, she would be expected to thank God for her fortune. So yes, the wedding feast had music. It had laughter and dancing. But it ended in a locked room, in the breaking of a girl's body, and in a silence so deep it swallowed whatever name she once had. In the soft dawn that follows the wedding night, the world outside the window might still be quiet. Birds might chirp. The hearth in the next room might be coaxed back to life. But in the marriage bed, something irrevocable has happened. The girl lying there is no longer a daughter. She is no longer a child. And legally, she is no longer a person. The vows she spoke or was coerced into murmuring triggered a transformation far more devastating than a change of title. She has become, in the eyes of the law, a covered woman, a femina covert. Her identity has been erased, absorbed fully and permanently into that of her husband. This doctrine of coverture, so deeply embedded in medieval law, meant that upon marriage a woman ceased to exist as an independent legal entity. She could not own property signed contracts or make decisions about her own household. She could not take a case to court, and she certainly could not defend herself in one unless her husband allowed it. Any wages she might earn belonged to him. Any inheritance she might receive became his. Even her dowry, the fortune her family paid to secure the marriage, was now legally his to use, to squander, or to give away. She had no right to reclaim it, even if she were abandoned. Even if he died, her access to any portion of the estate would be limited and hotly contested by his male relatives. There was no version of this transformation for the husband. His identity remained fully intact. He gained rights, he did not relinquish them. If anything, he became more powerful. He now possessed not only land and livestock, but a human being, one who was legally and religiously bound to obey him in all things. This wasn't metaphor. This was law, this was theology, this was everyday life. And if she resisted, if she tried to act independently, if she dared to write her own will, or sell a cow, or speak in her own defense, she could be punished not just socially but legally. She could be beaten, she could be imprisoned, she could be shunned. Historians still debate the nuances of coverture, and in truth it evolved over time and varied by region. But the central principle remained constant. A woman's legal identity was merged with her husband's, and she ceased to be recognized as a separate human being. She was no longer Margaret, daughter of Thomas. She became the wife of William. Her name, her lineage, her rights, her choices all subsumed. This meant she could not refuse him anything. If he ordered her to move across the country, she went. If he told her to stop speaking to her family, she obeyed. If he took her jewelry and gifted it to a mistress, it was his prerogative. If he chose to beat her for disobedience or silence her with threats, there was no court that would take her side. Domestic violence, as we understand it now, did not exist in law. It was not illegal to hit your wife. In fact, it was often encouraged as a way of maintaining order in the household. Some law codes even specify the size of the stick a man could use, a tradition that later gave rise to the phrase rule of thumb, although the exact origin remains debated. Even in death, her autonomy was limited. She could not choose where she would be buried. She could not write a will without her husband's permission. If she died in childbirth, which so many did, her belongings returned not to her family, but to her husband or his kin. She could not leave messages to her children. She could not request to be buried beside her mother. Her life and her death were managed by men. Oddly enough, there were tiny slivers of space where some women managed to slip through the cracks. In some merchant towns, widows were allowed to take over their husbands' businesses. These women, often already respected members of the guild through their husbands, could run shops, hire apprentices, and sign contracts. But this power only came after years of silence and subservience, and it vanished the moment they remarried. The second marriage triggered the reapplication of coverture. All that hard-earned independence disappeared overnight, and so many widows chose to remain unmarried not out of grief, but out of strategy. They understood that to marry again was to vanish again. Their only path to autonomy, however narrow and precarious, was through widowhood, and even then they faced constant pressure to remarry. Their sons might urge it, their brothers might arrange it, their in-laws might bribe or threaten, because a woman alone was suspicious, a woman with property was dangerous, and a woman with both was a problem to be solved. The church unsurprisingly reinforced these legal structures with divine authority. Priests preached sermons about the sanctity of marriage, the obedience of wives, and the natural order of male dominion. Biblical passages about female submission were emphasized and repeated. The story of Eve's sin in the garden became a justification for women's subjugation in the home. Her temptation was held against every daughter born after her. They were all considered prone to sin, to vanity, to rebellion, and marriage was the cure. Women were told that suffering was part of their spiritual duty, that pain in childbirth was a divine punishment, that silence was a virtue, that obedience brought them closer to God. Some saints were canonized for their patience in marriage, others were praised for dying quietly under their husbands' fists. The ideal medieval wife was one who accepted her erasure without complaint. And yet the system required her participation. She had to cook clean, bear children, manage the household, and represent her husband in his absence, all without recognition or reward. She was invisible when it came to rights, but essential when it came to labor. She was a ghost with responsibilities. There were no breaks, no days off, no avenues for protest. The rare women who did rebel were met with swift punishment. Some were cast out, others were locked in their rooms. A few were burned, hanged, or drowned under accusations of witchcraft, a convenient label for any woman who refused to disappear politely. The irony, of course, is that this system depended on women to function. They kept the homes running raised. The next generation passed on traditions, healed wounds, and told stories. They were the backbone of the community, and yet the law treated them like shadows. And so when a girl married in medieval Europe, she didn't just change her name or her address. She changed her status from living to covered, from seen to invisible, from subject to object. She stepped into a role that required everything from her body, her labor, her silence, while offering nothing in return but the illusion of belonging. She didn't just lose her freedom, she lost the right to ever ask for it again. The rules were clear from the start, etched into sermons and scrolls, whispered in hallways, and embroidered into tapestries a wife must obey. But the tools used to ensure that obedience were not just spiritual or social. They were blunt, literal, and often carved from wood. Under medieval law, a husband had the legal and moral authority to chastise his wife. Not only was it permitted, it was expected. A household was seen as a miniature kingdom, and the man was its lord. If his wife disobeyed him, spoke out of turn, failed to fulfill her duties, or merely irritated him, he had every right to strike her. And so many did. With sticks, with fists, with belts. Some used rods no thicker than their thumb, hence the infamous phrase, rule of thumb. A term still used casually today, even though most forget its grisly origins. There was no police force to intervene, no hotline to call, no shelter to run to. If a neighbor heard screams from the next house, he might shrug and say she must have burned the stew. If her family protested, they might be accused of meddling. If she ran away, she could be dragged back by force. The law was not interested in her bruises. The law was interested in maintaining order, and order in medieval thought meant hierarchy: man over woman, master over servant, priest over peasant. Disruption to that order was not seen as justice, it was seen as heresy. The husband's right to discipline his wife was rooted not only in civil law, but also in religious doctrine. Sermons often invoked the Apostle Paul's command, "Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as unto the Lord." This wasn't a metaphor. This was an instruction manual. Church fathers, like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, wrote that women were spiritually inferior, more prone to temptation, and incapable of full rationality. Therefore, they needed male guidance enforced if necessary. A man who failed to discipline his wife was accused not of mercy, but of weakness. If his household was disorderly, it was his shame, and she was the source of it. Historians still debate how common the most severe forms of abuse were, but the structure made it difficult to know. Most women couldn't read or write. Diaries were rare and confessions even rarer. But letters, court cases, and medical records paint a grim picture. One record from 14th century Yorkshire details a woman whose husband broke 3 of her ribs because she left the house without permission. He was fined 2 shillings, not for the violence, but for damaging property. She meanwhile was ordered to return home and pray for forgiveness. And then there were the cultural customs that enforced this violence not through law, but through ridicule. In parts of England, if a man was seen as too gentle with his wife, he might be paraded through the village on a donkey wearing a bonnet while children pelted him with old vegetables. This ritual humiliation, known as rough music, was meant to remind husbands to assert their dominance. The message was clear: a man who did not strike his wife when she erred was not a real man. And she was expected to thank him for his correction. The violence wasn't always physical. There was a quieter, more insidious kind of domination, the constant surveillance of every word and action. A wife's movements were watched, her tone analyzed, her friendship scrutinized. A laugh at the wrong moment could be taken as flirtation. A silence at the wrong dinner could be interpreted as defiance. She learned to live in a state of constant anticipation, walking a tightrope of obedience. One step too far in either direction and the punishment could be swift. Not always a beating. Sometimes it was isolation. Sometimes it was humiliation. Sometimes it was a sudden, terrifying silence from the man who held the keys to everything in her life. And there were rules for the beatings too. Some regions specified how many strikes were acceptable. Others dictated which parts of the body should be avoided. Bruises on the face were considered unseemly, not because of compassion, but because they might embarrass the husband in public. Better to strike the ribs, the back, the thighs, areas hidden beneath woolen skirts and linen sleeves. That way no one had to pretend not to see. No one had to pretend to care. One bizarre and horrifying tradition from parts of France involved the wife stick a ceremonial rod kept in the household, sometimes hung over the hearth, to remind the wife of her duties. It was rarely used in public, but its presence was never forgotten. Like a religious icon, it signaled that this home followed the proper order. That discipline was expected. That the woman who stirred the pot also knew her place. The church, rather than protecting women, often made things worse. Priests counseled women to accept punishment as purification. Pain, they said, brought one closer to Christ. One priest wrote that a husband's harshness was like God's wrath, fearful but just. Confessors advised wives not to resist, not to protest, but to pray. Some women, desperate and confused, blamed themselves for their beatings. They confessed not only their sins, but their bruises, hoping the penance would fix both. It rarely did. Oddly enough, the one time a wife might be heard was if her husband's violence became inconvenient for the community. If he beat her so badly that she could no longer work, no longer cook, clean, bear children, then neighbors might intervene, not to save her, but to restore function to the household. A broken wife was a broken tool, and a broken tool slowed everything down. She might be temporarily taken in by a relative, treated with herbs whispered about behind cupped hands. But once she could walk again, she'd be sent back. Always back. There were stories, rare ones, of women who fought back. A few took up knives in the dark, or poisoned their husband's mead, or fled into the woods. But most of these stories ended badly. If she killed him, it was petty treason punishable by burning at the stake. If she ran, she could be hunted down like a criminal. If she spoke out, her words were dismissed. She needed a man to speak for her. And if no man came forward, then her voice was silence. The cycle was cruel and complete. From the moment of her marriage, a woman was taught to expect violence. It was not a question of if, but when. She learned to anticipate moods, to read the subtle signs of danger in her husband's gait, his tone, his appetite. She learned to move quietly, to soothe quickly, to disappear into the corners of her own life. She didn't just survive the violence, she became part of it, absorbing it into her bones until it felt normal. And this was the true horror, not that it happened, but that it was expected. That society, law, and faith all agreed this was just how things were. A man ruled his household, and if ruling meant beating, so be it. No one wept. No one protested. And the girl, who had once sat trembling in her wedding gown, now trembled for a different reason, because the smallest mistake might cost her more than pride. It might cost her everything. In the medieval world, a wife's body did not belong to her. It belonged to her husband, her household, and her lineage, and perhaps more than anything to the unborn children expected to spring from her womb. Marriage was not simply a public alliance or a household merger. It was a reproductive contract. A silent ironclad agreement that her body would now serve as a vessel for heirs, preferably male, and that the measure of her success would be how many healthy sons she produced before her pelvis shattered or her breath gave out during childbirth. She could not say no. Refusal was not part of the vocabulary. A wife's consent was considered permanent, irrevocable, and all-encompassing the moment she uttered her vows. From that day forward, her husband had complete sexual rights to her body. There was no such thing as marital rape in medieval law. The concept simply didn't exist. The very idea that a husband could violate his wife was absurd to a society that saw her as part of his property. If he forced her, it wasn't a crime, it was a duty. If she resisted, she was a bad wife, a rebellious woman, a soul in need of correction. If she screamed, the walls of her home held the sound and let it fade. No one came running. Why would they? She had been given. She had been claimed. She had been promised. Historians still debate whether this framework was universally accepted, or whether even then some recognized it for the cruelty it was. Some ecclesiastical writings hint at a belief that marital intimacy should be mutual, that husbands should be gentle, that love and affection mattered. But those were whispers in a sea of authoritative thunder. The dominant message was clear: a wife had no autonomy over her sexuality. Her function was to receive, to conceive, and to obey. Anything else was unnatural, sinful, or heretical. The church reinforced this with terrifying consistency. Priests preached that a woman's duty was to be open to her husband in all things. Conjugal debt, they called it. The idea that each spouse owed the other their body, but in practice this debt was only collected one way. Wives were expected to satisfy their husbands on command. If she refused because of illness, exhaustion, or fear, she was violating not just her husband's rights, but God's plan. Some penitential manuals, the medieval equivalent of confession handbooks, advised husbands to be stern but not cruel when forcing an unwilling wife. Do not strike her face, one suggested. Bruises are unseemly. It was not uncommon for priests to encourage women to submit even when they were terrified. There's one record from a German village in the 14th century of a priest advising a woman to lie still and offer the pain to Christ. She was 14, newlywed, and had been beaten after screaming during consummation. Her sin apparently was disrupting the peace of her husband's soul. This violent entitlement extended through pregnancy. There was no reprieve for the expectant wife, no slowing down, no sanctuary. Even as her belly swelled and her back ached and her breath grew shallow, she was still expected to perform her duties in the marriage bed. To refuse sex while pregnant was considered selfish. Some men believed that frequent intercourse helped ensure the child would be male. Others simply believed it was their right. Her body did not stop being available just because it was already being used for one purpose. It was multi-purpose property. And when childbirth came, it brought its own horrors. There were no hospitals, no sterile instruments, no pain relief. Birth took place in the home, often in the same bed where the wedding had been consummated, sometimes with the same women who had helped strip the bride, now preparing the linens and boiling the water. She might have a midwife, but midwives were not doctors. They learned from experience, from tradition, from whispered advice passed down from their mothers. They did not have access to anatomical knowledge. They did not know how to handle breech births, hemorrhages, or infections. And yet childbirth was constant. A woman might give birth 10 or 12 times in her life more if she survived. Some women were pregnant every single year, from marriage until death. There was no birth control, no understanding of reproductive health, no spacing of children for safety. The goal was heirs, sons, and the pressure to produce them was crushing. If a wife failed to bear sons, she was blamed. If the children died young, she was suspected of curses, of sin, of witchcraft. In one case, from 1374, a woman was publicly flogged because her 7th child was stillborn. Her husband had insisted that she was cursed by demons. Odd fact, some women wore small religious charms around their necks during intercourse and childbirth, hoping they would protect the child. Saints were invoked like magical insurance policies. Saint Margaret of Antioch was particularly popular, said to protect women in labor. But no charm could change the fact that the risks were staggering. Some estimates suggest that 1 in 3 women died from childbirth or its complications. A few days of fever, a slow hemorrhage, a child lodged in the birth canal, and she would be gone. And still her husband had rights. If she screamed in pain and begged him not to touch her again, he could. If she was weak from labor and barely able to sit upright, he could take her again the next day. No one would stop him. In fact, some legal texts encouraged men to resume marital relations soon after birth to reassert their dominion and keep the wife from vanity. Vanity here meant self-preservation. There were, of course, women who endured, women who survived. Some grew tough in the face of these expectations. They learned to navigate their husbands' moods, to negotiate within the limits of their roles, to find moments of stillness between pregnancies. But survival was not the same as freedom, and the system did not reward them for endurance, it punished them for fatigue. If she became ill, she was called weak. If she grew bitter, she was accused of being unnatural. If she tried to rest, she was lazy. Her value was tied to her availability. And the moment she was no longer available, her value began to erode. Even widows were not safe. If she lived long enough to bury her husband, her reproductive record still followed her. How many sons had she produced? What inheritance did she carry? Would she remarry? Could she be sold again? The body never stopped being property, not even after death. And so, from the wedding night until the grave, a medieval wife's body was a battlefield, a space not of love, not of partnership, but of forced access and religiously sanctioned use. Her body gave birth to heirs. Her pain proved her purity. Her silence was seen as submission, and submission, they said, was her highest calling. The ticking clock of childbirth began almost immediately after the wedding night. A wife was expected to become pregnant as soon as possible, and not just once, but repeatedly, relentlessly, until her body gave out or the line of succession was secure. In many medieval households, pregnancy was not a blessed event, but a schedule to be maintained, a burden to be carried without question. She was not asked whether she was ready, whether she desired children, or whether she feared the pain. The only thing that mattered was the next heir, especially a male one. The expectation was clear birth until death or until the womb failed. There were no pregnancy tests, of course, no ultrasounds, no prenatal vitamins. A missed cycle, some nausea, and a whispered hope or fear would signal the beginning of yet another chapter in the wife's reproductive saga. The midwife would be notified. Preparations would begin. Sometimes a cradle was carved before the child had a heartbeat. Sometimes the wife was already pregnant with the next child before the previous one had taken its first steps. These were not isolated cases. This was the rhythm of married life for women recovered just enough to repeat. The pressure to produce male heirs weighed heavily on every woman, regardless of class. In royal courts, the birth of a son was celebrated with feasts and proclamations. The birth of a daughter might merit a quiet nod. If the child was stillborn or died within days, as many did, the wife bore the blame. Her husband might withdraw affection. Her in-laws might mutter behind doors. If the pattern continued, daughters stillbirths or no children at all, the consequences could be severe. The marriage could be annulled. She could be sent away. In extreme cases, she might be accused of witchcraft or adultery on the assumption that her failure to conceive was due to moral or supernatural failure. Historians still debate the exact maternal mortality rates in medieval Europe, but the consensus is grim. In some regions, as many as 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or shortly afterward. The causes were numerous: hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, eclampsia. But the root was the same: lack of medical knowledge, lack of hygiene, and a complete disregard for the toll of constant pregnancy. Midwives worked with herbs and prayers. Physicians, if available, often did more harm than good. They relied on theories of humors, balances of heat and moisture, and occasionally leeches. Bloodletting was sometimes prescribed during labor to relieve pressure. In practice, it relieved life. And yet women kept getting pregnant. Not because they wanted to, because they were expected to. Contraception, where it existed, was unreliable and often condemned by the church. Certain herbs were rumored to prevent pregnancy, wild carrot, pennyroyal rue, but they were dangerous in high doses and difficult to obtain. And if a woman was caught using them, she could be punished for interfering with God's will. The only acceptable family planning method was abstinence, and that was not the wife's decision to make. Odd fact, in some areas, religious penitents were instructed to confess attempts at birth control as serious sins. A woman who refused sex during fertile periods might be labeled disobedient. A man who spilled seed without purpose could be fined or flogged. And a wife who spoke out about her fear of pregnancy might be advised to focus more on prayer and less on herself. The fear of a childbirth haunted every woman. It was a known killer. Not an accident, not a rare misfortune, but a frequent visitor. And there were no death benefits, no maternal leave, no medical safety nets. If she died, the midwife might be blamed. If she survived but the baby didn't, she might be accused of carelessness. If she lost too much blood and grew weak, her husband might remarry before she healed. Widowers remarried quickly, not just for companionship, but to ensure the continuity of household labor and the production of heirs. And it wasn't just the birth that threatened her. The postpartum period was dangerous too. Puerperal fever, an infection caused by unclean hands or instruments, was common and deadly. There were no antibiotics. A woman might begin bleeding days after delivery and never stop. A wound might fester. A retained placenta could poison her from within. She might fade slowly over weeks as the family moved on and the cradle stayed empty. Those who survived often bore the scars visibly. Prolapsed organs, torn flesh, chronic pain, depression, but these things had no names. A woman who couldn't walk properly after her sixth child was said to be delicate. One who stared out the window for days was melancholic. A mother who refused to nurse a baby was selfish. There was no vocabulary for trauma. There was no space for grief. Her children might live, or they might not. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Nearly half of all children born in some regions died before the age of 5. Some died within days, others in their sleep, others from coughs, fevers, or malnutrition. The mother buried one and then carried another, and then another, and she was expected to bear it quietly, reverently, without interruption to the household rhythm. There are heartbreaking records of women who named child after child the same name because the previous ones died so quickly. Margaret again, then a third, as if willing the name into survival, as if repetition could defy fate. A woman's worth was often tied directly to her children's survival. She was praised for her strength if they lived, condemned for her sins if they didn't. She was told that suffering was part of holiness, that each pain brought her closer to God, that her womb was her altar, her cradle, her confession. And if she dared to speak otherwise, if she cried, complained, or asked not to be touched again, she was warned. She was reminded of her place. She was told that a barren tree is of no use, that a wife must bloom or be cut down. So she bloomed, again and again. Even when her branches cracked, even when her roots bled, even when no one came to see the flowers. Because that was the price of marriage in the medieval world: unending, unchosen, and often unacknowledged reproduction. A cycle that turned her body into a field, to be sown a vessel, to be filled a machine, to be run until it broke. And when it did, they found another. If against the odds a woman survived the whirlwind of childhood, marriage, brutal wedding night, and a decade or more of continuous pregnancy, she might one day find herself a widow. And with widowhood came a strange kind of liminality, a state that hovered uneasily between brief autonomy and renewed vulnerability. At first glance, being a widow in the medieval world might seem like a reprieve, even a victory. Her husband was dead. She could breathe. She might no longer be forced into the marriage bed. She might have a few coins to her name, but the reality was far more precarious. For many women, widowhood was just a short pause before being forced into a second marriage, or worse, into legal and social exile. Legally, the death of a husband didn't release a woman from the structures that had erased her personhood. Everything she possessed, land, money, even her own clothing, still belonged to her husband's estate. If she was lucky, she had been named in his will and might receive a third of his property in what was known as her dower right. But wills were not guaranteed, and family members, especially sons and brothers-in-law, often contested them. They argued that she had no real claim, that she had fulfilled her purpose by bearing children, and that now the estate must return to male control. And in the courts of the time, their arguments usually won. Historians still debate how often widows actually retained control of property. In some regions, merchant widows ran successful businesses and managed estates, albeit temporarily. But these cases were the exception, not the rule. In most villages and towns, a woman alone was viewed with suspicion. She had no husband to speak for her. She answered to no man. That made her dangerous. That made her a threat. And so she was pressured gently or forcefully into marrying again. This second marriage was rarely about affection. It was a convenience for her new husband, who might be a widower himself looking for someone to raise his children or run his farm. Sometimes it was arranged by her in-laws, eager to see her moved along, sometimes by the church, and sometimes by force. There are accounts of widows who were abducted, literally kidnapped by men who wanted their dowry or their land. One such case from 15th century France tells of a widow named Isabeau who had inherited a small vineyard after her husband's death. Within weeks, she was dragged from her home by a rival vintner and forced into marriage. The local magistrate, upon hearing the case, ruled in the man's favor. After all, she was now provided for. Odd fact in some areas, if a woman refused remarriage, she was legally required to live chastely and under supervision, often with male relatives who treated her more as a housekeeper than a guest. Her refusal to remarry was not seen as a personal decision, but as a defiance of social norms, and such defiance was rarely tolerated. In extreme cases, the church could declare her vows of chastity and bind her to them, essentially forcing her into a nun-like existence without the benefit of joining a convent. And even if she chose to remarry, it was rarely on her terms. Women had no real leverage in the marriage market, especially after childbearing years had passed. If she was still fertile, she was useful. If not, she might still be valuable for her labor or for the land she brought with her. But affection, respect, or mutual desire were not part of the equation. She was weighed and measured, not courted. If she had children from her first marriage, things grew even more complicated. She rarely had custody. Fathers held that right. Upon his death, guardianship typically passed to another male relative, not to the mother. A widow could be separated from her own children, watching from a distance as their lives unfolded in houses that once were hers. If she remarried, she might be allowed to bring her children along, but the new husband had full authority over them. If he didn't want them, they could be sent away. If they misbehaved, he could discipline them. If they inherited wealth, he could manage it. And if the children died, as so many did, her grief was not her own. It was filtered through the expectations of womanhood. She was expected to mourn modestly, to recover quickly, to return to her duties. If she wept too long or too openly, she might be accused of hysteria. If she did not grieve enough, she was heartless. There was no right way to be a bereaved mother in the medieval world, only ways to be wrong. Sometimes widowhood offered a flash of freedom. A few women used their temporary autonomy to live differently. They might run a household on their own terms, choose not to remarry, or support other women. Some entered convents not out of piety, but because it was the only place where they wouldn't be forced to marry again. A few became community figures respected and feared for their independence. But even these women lived under constant scrutiny. A wealthy widow could be accused of sorcery. An unmarried one could be labeled promiscuous. A woman with land could be called a usurper. There was, in short, no safe category for widows, no acceptable mold. They were liminal beings, no longer wives, not quite single, not virgins, not mothers, not brides. And in a society obsessed with defining women by their relationship to men, that made them deeply unsettling. One of the cruelest ironies was that the pain of widowhood, real sharp personal, was rarely acknowledged as individual grief. If her husband had been abusive, she was not expected to feel relief. If he had been kind, she was expected to remarry quickly anyway. If she had loved him, there was no vocabulary for what that meant. Love was not the language of marriage. Function was. And once her function ended, she was either reassigned or left to decay. And so widowhood was not liberation. It was just another stage in a life shaped entirely by men's decisions, a temporary gap in the machine, a pause before the next arrangement. She might dress in blacklight candles, speak softly for a while. But the world would not wait long. It would come knocking again with contracts, with suitors, with threats. Her choices would be few. Her time would be short. And the silence she had grown used to as a wife would follow her as a widow, only now it would echo louder. If marriage was the cage and childbirth the chain, then the law was the lock that kept it all sealed shut. There was no freedom in a medieval marriage, not legally, not socially, not spiritually. For women, the legal system did not simply fail to protect them. It actively participated in their confinement. The structure was airtight, deliberate, and terrifying in its simplicity. Once a woman said her vows, she lost the right to own property, to control her labor, to defend herself in court, and to refuse any command from her husband. And even in the rare moments when she might try to speak up or step out of bounds, the law was waiting to drag her back in. This wasn't accidental, it was codified, detailed in charters, contracts, sermons, and statutes. Under the doctrine of coverture, a woman became legally invisible once she married. She could not sign a contract. She could not sue or be sued. She could not even testify in her own defense without her husband's permission. Her words were not considered reliable. Her body was not considered her own. And her wages, if she worked, belonged entirely to her husband. Even if she had run a business before marriage, the moment the ring slid onto her finger, her ownership was revoked. Legal scholars of the time wrote about this transformation with a straight face. They compared marriage to a type of civil death for women, an event in which a woman ceased to exist as a separate entity and was absorbed into her husband's personhood. He would make all legal decisions. He would manage all property. He could even choose where she lived, with whom she spoke, and whether she could leave the house. There were no exceptions, not for education, not for age, not for prior status. Once married, the law stripped her bare, and still the system found new ways to reinforce itself. If a woman was beaten by her husband, the courts did not intervene. In fact, some regions allowed a husband to beat his wife within reason. The definition of reason, of course, was left to the man. He could strike her for disobedience, for laziness, for infertility. He could withhold food. He could imprison her in her own home. And if she tried to run, she could be hunted down and returned. Her flight was not escape, it was theft. She was stealing herself from her rightful owner. Historians still debate the precise mechanics of these laws from region to region, but the outcome was consistent. Legal frameworks were not neutral. They were weapons used to maintain a very specific order. Even when a woman brought a substantial dowry into the marriage, she had no control over it. Even if her name appeared on land deeds before the wedding, it was erased afterward. If she tried to challenge this erasure, if she argued in court, hired a legal representative, or demanded her rights, she risked being accused of being unnatural, unwomanly, or unchristian. And then there was the matter of children. A mother had no legal rights over her own offspring. They belonged to the father. He could decide their schooling, their inheritance, their marriages. If she was widowed, she might be granted temporary guardianship, unless of course the estate passed to another male heir, in which case she could be removed from their lives entirely. If she tried to flee with them, it was kidnapping. If she refused to let them go, it was treason. One particularly brutal case from 14th century Italy details a woman whose husband died leaving her with 2 small sons. His brother immediately claimed guardianship, arguing that she was emotionally unfit due to grief. She begged the court to let her keep her children. She even offered to renounce all property claims if she could raise them. The judge ruled against her. The children were taken and she was left with nothing, not even the names on a legal document. Even the church, which sometimes posed as a moral counterweight to secular law, reinforced the same message. Ecclesiastical courts could annul marriages, but only in very specific cases, if the union hadn't been consummated, if one party was already married, or if the spouses were closely related. Abuse, neglect, and misery were not valid grounds. A woman who begged for release from a violent marriage was told to pray. If she fled and sought refuge in a convent, she could be excommunicated for deserting her marital duty. And excommunication was not just spiritual, it meant social death. No one could feed her, shelter her, or speak to her without risking their own standing. Odd fact, some towns had actual marriage inspectors men appointed to ensure that marriages were being properly maintained. If a wife was found outside the home too often, or if she was suspected of refusing her husband, the inspectors could intervene. Not with counseling, but with fines, public shaming, or threats. Women were not citizens. They were tenants of a legal system built to control them. And all this legal cruelty was disguised as protection. Lawmakers argued that coverture kept women safe from the harsh realities of commerce and politics. That men were better suited to handle affairs of money and land. That women were too emotional to participate in serious decision-making. So the law helped them by silencing them, by disappearing them, by folding them neatly into the shadow of their husbands and locking the door behind. Even widows had to tread carefully. If a woman inherited anything, it was typically a small portion of her late husband's estate, barely enough to live on. If she remarried, the property passed to her new husband. If she remained single, she was often targeted by relatives who claimed she couldn't manage the land properly. Some were sued by their own sons. Others were accused of being witches or madwomen. Because a woman with land and no husband was an aberration, and the law hated aberrations. There was no version of medieval law in which a woman could live a fully autonomous life. At every turn she was met with paperwork, with clauses, with signatures she couldn't write. Every protection offered to her was conditional. Every right she had could be revoked. She was a ghost with chores, a shadow with children, a name on someone else's ledger. And so when a woman stepped into marriage, she wasn't stepping into partnership. She was stepping into disappearance. The law wrapped itself around her like a shroud, whispering that it was for her own good, that this was God's plan, that a woman who could not be owned would not be safe. But what it really meant was that she would never be free. From the very first chant of the marriage ceremony to the final whispered prayers over a woman's deathbed, the church hovered over every stage of her life, not as a shield, but as a shepherd. A shepherd, that is, who carried a staff and expected the sheep to obey. Religion was not merely a backdrop to medieval marriage. It was the foundation, the scaffolding, and often the chains. What we think of today as holy union, sacred commitment, and divine companionship was in the medieval church more often about submission, correction, and reproduction. The ceremony did not celebrate love. It consecrated hierarchy. The church did not officiate marriage to protect women. It blessed marriage to control them. Every vow a bride spoke at the altar was soaked in theology. She promised not only to love and honor, but to obey. Obedience wasn't suggested, it was required. Disobedience wasn't frowned upon, it was sinful. The priest's blessing spoken in Latin invoked not just divine favor, but divine surveillance. God was now watching, and God the priest said liked quiet wives, full cradles, and clean floors. Historians still debate how sincerely these beliefs were held by the average parishioner. Did peasants really absorb every word of the Latin Mass? Did noble women actually believe that God wanted them to endure beatings and die in childbirth? Perhaps not in every case. But even if the theology wasn't deeply understood, its effects were deeply felt. The church shaped expectations, created rituals, and taught through repetition. And it had the pulpit, and the pulpit had power. The teachings were clear: a wife must submit to her husband as she would to God. A husband must rule his wife as Christ rules the church. This comparison was repeated endlessly. It was beautiful on the surface and brutal underneath. Christ, after all, demanded perfection. Christ expected suffering. And in this analogy, the wife was both sinner and sacrifice. The church's interpretation of Genesis was perhaps its most devastating weapon. Eve, they taught, had disobeyed. Eve had brought sin into the world. Eve had tempted Adam, and by extension, tempted all men into ruin. Therefore, all women inherited her guilt. All women were naturally disordered, and marriage was the fence built to contain them. The pain of childbirth, that was Eve's punishment. The rule of men, that was God's correction. Your suffering wasn't tragic, it was deserved. In fact, it was holy. Odd fact, some medieval sermons encourage women to thank God for their trials. A difficult marriage, they said, was a blessing, in disguise a shortcut to heaven. If your husband beat you, be patient. If he cheated, forgive him. If he forced himself upon you, offer it up as penance. Saints were held up as models of submission. Saint Cecilia, who endured abuse with silent prayer. Saint Margaret, who died in childbirth and was canonized partly for her suffering. Holiness for women was indistinguishable from pain. And then there were the confessions. Medieval confessionals were not safe spaces. They were moral inspections. Women were expected to confess not only their sins, but their thoughts, their discontent, their weariness. A woman who complained of her husband's cruelty might be told to pray harder. A woman who questioned her role might be accused of pride. The solution to female misery, the church said, was not freedom. It was more faith. Women's spiritual lives were tightly regulated. They could attend Mass but rarely speak. They could become nuns, but only if their families paid. And once cloistered, they were expected to remain silent and obedient within the convent's walls. Even mystics, women who experienced visions or claimed divine communication, were treated with suspicion. If their messages aligned with church doctrine, they were praised. If not, they were silenced or burned. In marriage, a woman's spiritual worth was measured by her compliance. She must not challenge her husband's decisions. She must not contradict him in public. She must not withhold her body. If she did any of these things, she was not only breaking marital expectations, she was disobeying God. This framework extended into every corner of the marital home. If a wife wanted to fast, she needed her husband's permission. If she wanted to give alms, he had to approve. If she wanted to confess a sin that involved him, the priest might decline to hear it. Her soul was her husband's responsibility, but not in the way that protected her. More like how a shepherd is responsible for keeping the sheep from wandering off a cliff. The church's involvement in marriage wasn't just spiritual, it was administrative. Marriages had to be sanctioned. Disputes were heard in ecclesiastical courts. Priests kept records, settled dowry disagreements, and sometimes even enforced consummation. There are records of church officials urging reluctant brides to fulfill their marital duties, even when they were underage. One bishop in 14th century France wrote to a noblewoman's father instructing him to remind your daughter that marriage without the embrace is not marriage at all. She was 13. And annulments, forget it. Unless you were wealthy, powerful, or scandalous in a way that threatened the church's reputation, an annulment was almost impossible. Abuse wasn't valid grounds. Neglect wasn't valid. Infertility was sometimes allowed, but only if the husband petitioned. For women, there was no easy way out. The church taught that marriage was indissoluble, a sacrament that bound two souls together until death. If one partner became violent, the other was told to suffer in silence and trust in divine justice. The result was a theological trap. Women were told that their suffering was noble, their submission sacred, their silence golden. They were taught that love meant endurance, that faith meant obedience, and that freedom was dangerous. And this wasn't whispered in back rooms, it was proclaimed from pulpits inscribed on altars painted in frescoes. In cathedrals across Europe, women knelt beneath images of Eve clutching her fruit, her shame eternal. The message was clear. You are her daughter. You will atone. Even the most sacred rituals reinforced the hierarchy. During the wedding ceremony, the bride was given away by her father to her husband, literally handed over like property passed from one steward to another. The priest's blessing invoked God not to protect the bride, but to sanctify the transfer. The ring placed on her finger was not a symbol of mutual love, it was a brand, a circle of metal to bind her, not to honor her. And so the church did not just witness medieval marriage, it shaped it. It did not just reflect cultural norms, it forged them. It taught generations of women that pain was their path to salvation, that obedience was their highest virtue, and that their bodies were holy only when they were passive. And the most chilling part, it worked. For centuries women prayed for the strength to endure what should never have been demanded of them. They lit candles not for justice but for patience. They begged not for escape but for peace within captivity. Because the church had taught them that suffering was not only normal, it was sacred. The rituals didn't end at the altar or the bedroom. They carried into the public sphere, woven into every gesture and glance, into the very fabric of the feast, the village, the life that followed. If medieval marriage was a system of control, then public humiliation was one of its most efficient tools, normalized, repeated, and made almost invisible through its performance. A bride's shame wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated, designed not only to subjugate her, but to amuse, to entertain, to reinforce her position as less than. The humiliation was loud, it was shared, and most horrifying of all, it was expected. Take the bedding ceremony. Yes, we've already visited that quiet horror behind the chamber door, but what happened around it was even more disturbing. In some parts of Europe, the newlyweds weren't just escorted to their room, they were followed, not metaphorically, literally followed. Guests, often drunk and jeering, trailed them with laughter and chants. Some held torches, some tossed flower petals, some cracked vulgar jokes about what was to come. It was part carnival, part courtroom. A group of men, family, friends, or in some cases servants, would sometimes even remain just outside the bedchamber to listen. Listen for the sounds of consummation. Listen for her cries, his grunts, the creaking of the bed. And if they didn't hear anything, they'd knock, they'd cheer, they'd sing louder, because in the medieval mindset, this wasn't private. It was civic. The act of marriage had to be verified not just by legal record or divine blessing, but by noise and mess. Sometimes the stained bed sheets were paraded the next morning, held aloft as proof of the bride's virginity. Blood on linen was seen not as tragedy, but as triumph. If the sheets were clean, questions were asked, whispers began. In some towns, the absence of blood could result in annulment accusations of infidelity or outright violence. The bride's pain wasn't just personal, it was public property. And even before the wedding night, there were layers of subtle humiliation. The Garda ceremony, for example. Today it's romanticized, a quaint tradition at weddings, but in its origin, it was a performance of dominance. The groom would remove the bride's garter in front of guests, often reaching beneath her dress, while others clapped and hooted. In some places, this moment was deliberately prolonged for laughs. Guests would wager on how quickly he could find it, and then he would toss it into the crowd like a trophy, while his bride sat silently, her thigh exposed, her body no longer hers. These public humiliations were not seen as cruel. They were seen as tradition, celebration. Guests laughed because they were meant to. No one questioned the discomfort. No one paused to ask if the bride was afraid or ashamed. She was a prop in a pageant, a symbol of fertility, of alliance, of the continuation of male legacy. Historians still debate how widespread these practices were and how they varied across regions and classes. But the evidence is consistent. Public rituals around marriage reinforced hierarchy through performance. The bride's silence, her stillness, her lack of resistance, these were applauded. Her body displayed or discussed was not a breach of privacy. It was part of the show. Even in the wedding feast, her humiliation continued. While the men toasted and laughed and swapped stories, the bride was expected to remain composed, serene, untouched by the chaos around her. A single misplaced gesture could be used against her. If she smiled too much, she was flirtatious. If she didn't smile at all, she was cold. She couldn't win, and she wasn't meant to. One odd tradition from late medieval Germany involved a game played at weddings where male guests attempted to steal kisses from the bride throughout the night. It was treated as harmless fun. But what if she resisted? What if she cried? Then she was spoiling the mood. She was being difficult. The game continued. Her discomfort was not a problem. It was part of the entertainment. And then came the songs. Bawdy songs, sung loudly, sometimes shouted. Lyrics that described what would happen on the wedding night in lurid detail. Sometimes these songs were performed by professional minstrels, sometimes by family members. No one considered how the bride might feel, sitting at the center of a room filled with men joking about the loss of her virginity like it was a town fair. The deeper cruelty is this. These rituals didn't just hurt her in the moment. They trained her, conditioned her, taught her that public violation was normal, expected, blessed, that her embarrassment was something others had a right to witness, that her shame was part of her value. If she endured it quietly, she was a good wife. If she resisted, she was a disgrace, and these lessons followed her long after the feast ended. She would be watched in the weeks that followed. Watched for signs of pregnancy, of contentment, of obedience. If she was seen smiling too much, she might be accused of infidelity. If she was seen weeping, others would wonder what her husband had to correct. If she failed to become pregnant within a few months, the whispers would return. What was wrong with her? Was she barren? Was she cursed? Even her clothes played a role in her continued surveillance. A new wife wore different fabrics, different colors. In some villages, she wore her hair differently. In others, she wore a particular cap that signaled her change in status. These signals weren't for fashion, they were for control. Everyone could now identify her as someone's wife, and that meant she had responsibilities, limitations, expectations, and no privacy. There were no secrets in medieval marriage, not for her. Her fertility, her obedience, her pain, her shame, they were all visible, trackable, discussable. She was a communal object, her life a theater of control. And every ritual from garter toss to stained sheet, from wedding night chants to public inspections, reminded her of what she had become. She wasn't just a woman, she was a wife, and in the medieval world that was something far less. Everything about marriage in medieval society, its legal structure, its rituals, its theology, was engineered for one purpose: to maintain male power. The woman, whether peasant or noble virgin or widow, rich or poor, existed not as a partner, but as a mechanism. She was expected to be useful, fertile, obedient, silent. She was never intended to be free. Every rule surrounding her life was drafted by men. Every punishment she might receive was decided by men. Every protection she was promised came with the caveat that it could be revoked by men. Her life was not hers. It was built for the service of others, and that service began with her very first breath. From the moment a girl was born, the machinery began to turn. Her family measured her worth by the dowry they would one day offer. Her behavior was scrutinized. Modesty was praised, assertiveness punished. If she laughed too loudly, she was warned. If she climbed a tree or tore her dress, she was scolded. A good girl was one who practiced being a wife before she even understood what a wife was. She helped in the kitchen, she cared for younger siblings, she learned how to mend and cook and stay small. Everything about her childhood was a rehearsal for subservience. And all of it was praised in the name of virtue. By the time she reached adolescence, if she wasn't already married, she was bombarded with expectations. She was not encouraged to ask questions. She was taught to listen. She was not educated beyond what would make her useful to a household. Reading, perhaps if her family was wealthy. Writing, less likely. Philosophy, forbidden. What use did a wife have for thoughts? Her mind was meant to hold recipes, not ideas. Her words were meant for lullabies, not debate. Historians still debate how self-aware medieval society was about the system. Did they believe they were oppressing women, or did they truly think they were protecting them? Perhaps both. The justifications for this structure were everywhere, in sermons, in laws, in stories, in art. The natural order, they called it. Men ruled, women served, and anyone who challenged that order, any woman who spoke too freely, who refused marriage, who failed to bear children, was labeled unnatural, dangerous, possibly demonic. Odd fact, the word hysteria comes from the Greek word for uterus, hystera. Medieval physicians believed that many female ailments, especially emotional ones, were caused by a wandering womb. If a woman was angry, sad, confused, or refused sex, it was said that her womb had floated around inside her body, disturbing her thoughts. The cure: marriage, sex, pregnancy, in other words, obedience. Medical treatment too became a tool for control. Even literature, that great window into the medieval imagination, reflected this domination. Courtly love stories might show noble women adored from afar, but those tales were fantasies, idealizations of love that existed outside marriage. Within marriage, the tone was different. Women were wives, not muses. They were instructed, not adored. Their beauty was for reproduction, their piety for compliance. The only time a woman could be truly free in a medieval story was if she was a saint or a ghost. And then there was the economy. A woman's financial reality was entirely dependent on men. She brought a dowry to her marriage, but had no control over it. If her husband died, her access to that money was limited. If she worked, her earnings belonged to her husband. If she inherited land, she could only keep it if she remained unmarried and had no sons. She was wealth when she arrived, and burden once she stayed. And so she had to prove her worth daily through labor, through childbirth, through silence. If she failed, the consequences were swift. She could be sent away. She could be locked in a room. She could be beaten. And the law would not help her. The priest would not help her. Her family might not even take her back. Once married, she was no longer their concern. She had been transferred like a parcel, and return to sender was not an option. And yet, despite the weight of this structure, there were women who resisted, quietly, subtly, bravely. A widow who chose never to remarry. a mother who educated her daughters in secret, a midwife who whispered ancient herbal knowledge in a world ruled by male physicians, a girl who ran away in the night barefoot across frozen fields rather than enter a marriage she could not survive. Their stories are rare, buried, often erased, but they existed. And in their small rebellions, they left a trace, a hint, that not every woman accepted the fate laid out for her. But those acts of defiance were dangerous. A woman who refused to marry could be labeled a witch. A wife who struck back at her husband could be executed for petty treason. A girl who resisted her arranged match could be confined to a convent, or worse, forced into it and forgotten. Freedom was not just hard, it was nearly impossible. And so most women stayed, not because they didn't dream of freedom, but because the cost of seeking it was so high. They made do. They found joy where they could in the laughter of children, in the comfort of other women, in the softness of candlelight. But always, the rules loomed. The expectation, the system. It wasn't personal. It was structural. It wasn't about individual cruelty, though there was plenty of that. It was about design. The rules of medieval marriage were drawn to ensure that men had power and women did not. And then they wrapped those rules in scripture and silk and song until the oppression looked like honor, until slavery looked like sanctity. And the most tragic part, it worked. For centuries. It defined the generations of women and shaped the world that came after. The echoes of these marriages, these ceremonies dressed in lace and fear, these contracts written in silence and sealed with blood, have not faded. Though the Middle Ages are long past, their systems, their structures, their assumptions remain threaded through the present in subtle, often unexamined ways. The brutality wasn't a glitch in the medieval system, it was the system. And even now the residue lingers in laws, in language, in what we expect of women and what we forgive in men. When we look at the medieval marriage not as an isolated tradition, but as the foundation of Western marital norms, the scope of its influence becomes chilling. The belief that a wife's body belongs to her husband, that her reproductive capacity defines her worth, that her voice carries less legal weight than his, these ideas didn't die with the fall of feudalism. They simply changed clothes. For centuries after the Middle Ages, coverture remained embedded in the law. Marital rape wasn't even recognized as a crime in many parts of the world until the late 20th century. And in some places, it still isn't. The medieval marriage didn't end at the altar. It spread into parenting, into education, into labor markets. Generations of women were raised to believe that subservience was virtue and that endurance was holy. The ideal wife became not a partner, but a mirror, a reflection of her husband's needs, desires, and legacy. Her story disappeared, her name changed, her freedom dissolved, and somehow this was sanctified as love. The language persists. Even now, in modern ceremonies, echoes remain. A father gives away the bride. She may still take his name. Vows still often include the word obey. And though we claim equality, the expectations around motherhood, household labor, emotional labor all trace their lineage back to the medieval household, where a woman's worth was measured in heirs and hospitality. Historians still debate how much of this legacy shapes our present consciously, but there's no denying its fingerprints. When women are shamed for not marrying, when they're asked why they don't have children, when their earnings lag behind men's, or their ambition is labeled aggressive, these are not random. They are the descendants of a system built long ago in stone churches and smoky feasting halls under banners that read not love, but lineage. Odd fact, the word husband comes from Old Norse roots meaning householder, the one who owns, who rules, who keeps. And the word wife, it simply meant woman. Not ruler, not keeper, not partner, just woman. Unqualified, unprotected. And still women endured, not because they were weak, but because they had no choice. And within those brutal structures, They carved out moments of tenderness, a lullaby sung with cracked lips, a bread crust saved for a starving child, a prayer whispered through tears. Love existed, it just wasn't allowed to flourish. And yet it did, quietly, fiercely, in defiance of the rules. Some women found ways to wield soft power. A clever mother-in-law, a persuasive midwife, a widow who used her years of enforced silence as armor in a legal battle she finally won. These stories are fewer fainter, but they matter. They remind us that even in systems designed to erase them, women left fingerprints. On scrolls, on tombstones, on the lives of daughters who came after. And as for the men, they too were shaped by this world. They were taught that dominance was duty, that emotion was weakness, that control was love. Many suffered beneath the very weight of the expectations they enforced. But unlike the women, they had exits, they had rights, they had names that stayed on the land. And now, centuries later, we inherit all of it. The rights, the ghost, the wounds, and the wisdom. Understanding medieval marriage isn't just an academic exercise, it's a reckoning, a reminder of how deeply control can be normalized, how oppression can be dressed up as ceremony, how suffering can be blessed and still be wrong. So if you ever walk into a wedding and see a woman smile behind a veil, remember not so long ago that veil was a shroud. Not so long ago the vows were a contract. Not so long ago the bells that rang were not for joy, but for the burial of a girl's name, voice, and will. The world has changed, but not enough. And it's our job, yours, mine, all of us, awake in the quiet hours to remember to notice and to make sure that no woman ever has to survive what was once called a wedding. Tonight, we walked through the shadows of medieval marriage, not the fairy tale versions with flowing gowns and noble knights, but the true stories, the quiet cruelties the systems built to suppress. We saw how girls were married off before they could dream how their wedding night was not a beginning but a wound. We saw how the law erased their names, how religion sanctified their pain, how the rituals of celebration became performances of humiliation. We witnessed how a woman's body became a ledger, her womb a battleground, her silence a virtue. Her value was measured in land and blood. Her love, if she dared to feel it, was irrelevant. From birth to death, her life was not her own. And yet somehow she lived. She endured. She carved out tenderness in a world that offered none. She left behind echoes, warnings, traces of resistance. What we learned tonight was not just history. It was memory, collective, lingering, still pulsing beneath the surface of our modern lives. The medieval wedding may be gone, but the framework it built, the expectations it cemented, still cast long shadows. And if we do not look at them directly, we risk walking backward into them. So sleep now, not in fear, but in quiet understanding. History is not here to haunt us. It's here to remind us what not to repeat, what to question, what to dismantle, and what to protect. Good night, dear listener. You are free, you are enough, and you are not property. Good night.